The town of Ravenshade was home to many eerie tales, but none were as whispered about as the legend of the old Greyston Library. Standing at the edge of the town's forgotten district, its towering Gothic architecture loomed over the abandoned streets like a silent sentinel. By day, it functioned as any other library, a quiet sanctuary for scholars and book lovers. But by night, it transformed into something else entirely. No one dared to linger past dusk, for it was said that after midnight, the books moved on their own, and unseen fingers turned the pages. Elliot Graves had always been drawn to the macabre. A budding journalist with a passion for the supernatural, he had spent years chasing ghost stories, though none had ever yielded more than overactive imaginations and creaking floorboards. When he heard about Greyston Library's legend, he knew this was his chance to uncover something truly chilling. The librarian, Miss Thatcher, was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a voice as brittle as dried leaves. She had worked at Greyston for over 4 decades and had seen many curious minds come and go, yet none stayed past closing time. "You shouldn't meddle with things you don't understand, Mr. Graves," she warned as he set up his camera in a secluded corner of the library. "There are stories older than this town itself, some pages are best left unread." Elliot smirked, brushing off her ominous words. He had heard countless warnings before. He would stay the night, record any strange occurrences, and finally have the evidence he needed to make his name in investigative journalism. As the grand clock in the main hall struck midnight, the library exhaled a hollow breath. The chandeliers swayed slightly, though there was no wind. The air grew thick with an unplaceable scent, like parchment left too long in the damp. Elliot, adjusting his camera, felt a sudden chill brush past him. He turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing behind him, but there was only the endless maze of towering bookshelves. He inhaled deeply and whispered into his recorder, "It's midnight. The air feels different. Heavy. Almost like the library is awake." A creak echoed through the vast hall. Elliot's heart pounded as he turned toward the sound. One of the bookshelves at the far end of the room groaned, as if something unseen had brushed against it. Then, without warning, a book slid out from the shelf and crashed to the floor. Elliot swallowed hard and approached the fallen book. Its cover was bound in deep red leather, the title embossed in gold, "The Forgotten Tales of Ravenshade." He bent down, picking it up cautiously. As he did, a rush of cold air swelled around him, and the pages began flipping rapidly on their own. He stumbled backward, watching in horror as the book settled on a specific page. The ink looked fresh, as though written mere moments ago. "To the one who seeks the truth, beware the price of curiosity. For knowledge once gained cannot be forgotten, and some stories should remain untold." The word sent a shiver down his spine. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, and a whispering sound filled the room. It was a symphony of hushed voices, rising and falling, as if the books themselves were conversing in a language long lost to time. Elliot gripped his camera, panning the lens across the room. The whispering intensified, weaving through the aisles, slithering around him like unseen tendrils. Then, from the darkness beyond the shelves, a shadow shifted. He froze. A figure emerged, barely visible between the towering bookcases. It was draped in what looked like a tattered librarian's cloak, its face obscured by the dim light. The figure held a book in its skeletal fingers, slowly turning its pages. But there was something deeply unsettling about its presence. It did not move like a living being. It drifted, its form wavering as though it existed between reality and nightmare. Elliot's breath hitched as the figure lifted its head. Though its face remained hidden in shadow, he could feel its gaze burrowing into him, hollow and infinite. The book in its hands began to disintegrate into black ash, vanishing into nothingness. Then, it spoke. "You should not be here." The voice was a low whisper, yet it filled the entire library, reverberating through the walls. Elliot took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his feet remained planted. With an unnatural swiftness, the figure raised a long, bony finger and pointed to the book in Elliot's hands. The pages flared to life, ink bleeding across them, forming new words right before his eyes. "The next chapter begins, and so does the debt. Leave now, or be written into the story." The temperature plummeted, frost blooming along the edges of the bookshelves. Elliot's breath came out in visible puffs, his fingers trembling as he clutched the cursed book. The figure remained motionless, waiting. The clock in the hall chimed once. A single, resounding note. The floor beneath Elliot's feet creaked, as though something was shifting beneath the wooden planks. He glanced down and felt his stomach drop, shadows pooled around his shoes, stretching unnaturally, reaching for him like grasping hands. He bolted. Racing through the labyrinth of bookshelves, he could hear the whispering growing louder, more insistent. The shadows chased him, flowing like liquid, their tendrils snaking around the corners of his vision. The exit was in sight, the grand double doors only a few feet away. He lunged forward, grasping the handles and yanking them with all his strength. They didn't budge. A frigid breath tickled the back of his neck. He didn't dare turn around. "You cannot leave." The voice was right behind him now, inches away. Elliot clenched his eyes shut, forcing his mind to focus. This isn't real. This isn't real. But the weight of the book in his hands argued otherwise. The second chime rang out. And the darkness swallowed him whole. The moment Sarah turned the page of the ancient book, the library seemed to exhale, a deep, shuddering breath that made the candle flames waver. A gust of icy air swept through the aisles, making the books tremble on their shelves. It was as if someone, had been waiting for this moment. She clutched the leather-bound tome, its brittle pages quivering in her hands. The words had changed. The letters twisted and rearranged themselves before her eyes, forming a new passage that hadn't been there moments ago. "You are not alone, Sarah. We are watching." Her breath caught in her throat. The ink seemed wet, fresh, as though written just now. She ran her trembling fingers over the words. The ink smeared slightly, proving it had only just been written. A slow creaking sound echoed from the far end of the library. She whipped her head around. One of the high bookshelves was moving, shifting. The towering wooden structure groaned as it slid a few inches forward, revealing a narrow gap behind it. Sarah hesitated, heart hammering against her ribs. Had the shelf moved on its own? Or had someone, pushed it? She stepped forward cautiously. The air smelled of dust and something deeper, older. The narrow space beyond the bookshelf was dark, impossibly dark. She fumbled for her phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam sliced through the blackness, illuminating a corridor lined with cobwebbed shelves. Her feet hesitated, her mind screaming at her to turn back. But she was past the point of reason now. The library had already drawn her in too deep. As she stepped into the hidden passage, the light flickered. The door to the library slammed shut behind her. The moment the heavy door closed, the air thickened. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. The only sound was her own breathing, shallow, rapid, uneven. Sarah forced herself to take another step. The walls of the passage were lined with old books, their spines cracked, their titles faded into oblivion. Some had no titles at all, just blank, aged leather covers. She reached for one absent-mindedly and pulled it off the shelf. A strange chill ran up her arm the moment she touched it. The book was unmarked, no title, no author. Just a plain, black cover. But when she flipped it open, her blood turned to ice. Inside, the pages weren't filled with text. They were filled with names. Thousands of names, written in shaky, desperate handwriting. Some of the ink was smeared, as though written in a hurry. Others were scratched out violently, almost tearing the pages apart. And then she saw it. Her own name. Sarah's fingers went numb. Her name was written near the bottom of the last page, freshly inked. Below it, there was a single blank space, just one more name left to be written. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't possible. Someone had been expecting her. Someone had written her name before she even found this place. A sudden rustling made her drop the book. It landed with a dull thud at her feet, kicking up a small cloud of dust. And then, the whispering began. It came from everywhere and nowhere, soft voices brushing against her ears like a breeze. Words she couldn't understand, spoken in hushed, urgent tones. The bookshelves trembled. The passage seemed to stretch, elongate, the darkness at the far end deepening into something alive. Sarah turned, ready to bolt back to the entrance, only to find that the doorway was gone. The bookshelves had shifted again, sealing her inside. The whispering grew louder. "Turn the page, Sarah." The voice was right behind her. She spun around, heart in her throat. The flashlight beam caught something moving at the edge of her vision, a shadow, tall and thin, watching her from between the shelves. And then, it reached out. A skeletal hand, long and bony, slid between the shelves. The fingers twitched, beckoning. The shadowed figure remained hidden, but Sarah could feel its eyes locked onto her, unblinking. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The whispers turned into laughter, low, echoing giggles that overlapped, growing distorted. The books on the shelves began to move. They shifted and trembled, some flying out violently, crashing to the ground. Pages fluttered open, revealing illustrations of eyeless figures, bodies twisted in unnatural positions, mouths frozen in silent screams. Sarah grabbed one of the fallen books, her hands shaking as she flipped through it. The illustrations moved. The drawings shifted. The eyeless figures turned their heads toward her. She screamed, throwing the book aside. The figure in the darkness took a step forward. The air turned bitterly cold. Sarah's breath came out in white puffs. The overhead lights flickered, once, twice, before plunging the corridor into complete darkness. She fumbled with her phone, but the flashlight app refused to work. Then, just inches from her face, a voice rasped. "Your name is written. You must take your place." Something grabbed her wrist. A freezing grip, impossibly strong. She struggled, yanking her arm back, but the thing held tight. Its fingers dug into her skin, cold as death. And then, it started pulling her into the shelves. She fought, clawing at the air, kicking against the wooden floor, but it was useless. The darkness swallowed her whole. The last thing she saw was the ancient book lying on the floor, its pages turning on their own. Her name vanished from the list. The blank space beneath it filled itself in. A new name appeared. Yours. The darkness swallowed Sarah whole. For a moment, she was weightless, as though suspended in a void, adrift in a place that was neither here nor there. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against her ears, thick and suffocating. Then, suddenly, the world came rushing back. She landed hard on a cold, stone floor. Dust billowed around her as she gasped for air, her lungs burning from the sheer panic that gripped her chest. The floor beneath her was rough, uneven, not the wooden planks of the library. She wasn't in the passage anymore. She scrambled to her feet, her phone still clutched in her trembling hand. The screen flickered wildly, but the light barely cut through the suffocating darkness. Then she heard it. A slow, deliberate dragging sound. Something heavy was moving in the distance, scraping against the stone. The noise sent a shiver down her spine. She lifted her phone, the weak glow revealing towering bookshelves stretching endlessly in all directions. The walls were carved from old stone, damp and crumbling. This wasn't the library she had walked into, this was something beneath it. Something forgotten. Sarah took a cautious step forward. The whispering voices returned, echoing off the ancient walls. But this time, they weren't just whispers. They were pleas. "Help me. Trapped. Don't turn the page." A cold chill crept up her spine. She spun around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voices, but there was nothing, just rows upon rows of decaying bookshelves. The air smelled of mold, old paper, and something far more sinister. And then, a shadow moved. Just at the edge of her vision, something darted between the shelves. A flicker of motion, too fast to be human. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering. Then, from the darkness, a voice emerged. Deep, rasping. "You should not have come." She turned sharply, and that's when she saw it. Standing at the far end of the aisle was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its body wrapped in tattered robes that seemed to shift like smoke. Its head was wrong, elongated, the skin stretched taut over an angular skull. But its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were nothing but hollow sockets, leaking black mist. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just watched. Sarah took a step back, but the thing raised a skeletal hand. The books around her exploded from the shelves, flying through the air like projectiles. She ducked, narrowly avoiding a massive tome that smashed into the stone floor beside her. She turned to run, but the aisles had changed. Where there had been open space before, now stood an impenetrable wall of bookshelves. She was trapped. The librarian's domain. The figure took a slow step forward. The dragging sound returned, echoing through the chamber. Sarah pressed herself against the shelves, her mind racing. She had to find a way out. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit. Then, she saw it, an arched doorway at the far end of the aisle. It was small, almost hidden behind the towering shelves, but it was there. Her only way out. She bolted. The figure let out a low, guttural growl and lunged. The entire chamber shifted. The bookshelves trembled violently, shifting and rearranging themselves, as though the library itself was alive, trying to keep her trapped. Sarah weaved through the narrow aisles, her breath ragged. Books flew off the shelves, some flipping open midair, revealing pages covered in moving ink. The words slithered like snakes, forming cryptic messages. "Turn back. You cannot leave. You belong here." She ignored them, sprinting towards the doorway. The creature screeched. Its voice was an unnatural mix of whispers and screams, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. Sarah dared a glance over her shoulder, it was chasing her. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it were flickering between two places at once. 1 second it was at the end of the aisle. The next, it was just a few feet away. Sarah pushed herself harder, her legs burning as she reached the arched doorway. Without thinking, she threw herself through the opening, slamming the door behind her. Darkness. Silence. She was in another room. Her breathing was ragged as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her fingers trembling. The creature hadn't followed. But something was different. The room was circular, lined with old, wooden desks covered in tattered scrolls and ink-stained parchment. Ancient chandeliers hung above, their candles flickering weakly. And in the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it lay a single book. Sarah hesitated. Everything in her screamed, "Don't go near it." But her body moved on its own. She approached the pedestal, her fingers hovering over the book's leather-bound cover. Unlike the other books in the library, this one looked pristine, as if untouched by time. She slowly opened it. Her own face stared back at her. A perfectly detailed illustration of her, eyes wide with terror, standing exactly as she was now. Beneath the drawing was a passage. The girl read the book, unaware that she was reading her own story. As she reached the end of the page, the door behind her creaked open, and she realized. She was not alone. A cold wave of dread washed over her. The door behind her creaked. Slowly. Sarah's breath hitched. She didn't want to turn around. She couldn't. The book's final line began to change, the ink shifting like liquid. New words formed. She turned the page. Sarah's hands trembled as the compulsion to turn the next page became unbearable. It was as if something else was controlling her. Her fingers moved. She flipped the page. And the moment she did, the room went black. The whispers turned into deafening screams. Something grabbed her from behind. Her own voice joined the chorus of screaming souls. The darkness wasn't just around Sarah, it was inside her. A freezing chill spread through her veins as the unseen force tightened its grip around her body. Her screams were swallowed by the void, her voice lost in the sea of agonized wails echoing from all directions. Then, silence. A sharp pain shot through her skull as the world twisted and pulled at her like a ragdoll. Her body felt weightless, as if she were falling, and then, she landed. The library that shouldn't exist. She gasped, her lungs burning. She was back in the library. But something was wrong. The bookshelf stood taller than before, twisting toward the ceiling like gnarled roots. The walls pulsed as though they were breathing, and the air smelled stale, like time itself had rotted here. Sarah slowly got to her feet, her knees trembling. She recognized this place. It was the library's main hall. But the exit doors were gone. In their place stood rows upon rows of bookshelves that stretched into infinity. A realization hit her like a thunderclap. She had turned the page. And now, she was inside the book. Her heart pounded as she looked down at the open tome still clutched in her hands. The words on the page had changed. She realized too late, this library was no longer hers. It belonged to the stories. And she had become one of them. Sarah's breath hitched. Her fingers traced the ink, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A prophecy? Before she could react, a soft shuffling sound echoed between the towering shelves. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned her head. Between the bookshelves, figures moved. Dozens of them. Pale, hollow-eyed shadows of people. Some wore old-fashioned clothing, their features blurred as if they had been forgotten by time. Others had expressions twisted in eternal terror, their mouths open in silent screams. They were characters. Trapped in unfinished stories. Sarah staggered backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The figures watched her. Unmoving. Hollow. Then, one of them stepped forward. It was a girl, no older than 14, with long, tangled hair and a tattered dress. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with something more than just fear. Desperation. She opened her mouth, her voice barely above a whisper. You must write your ending, before it writes itself. Sarah's blood ran cold. Before she could ask what that meant, the ground trembled. The bookshelves shifted, moving on their own, twisting and reshaping like a labyrinth. And then, it emerged. The Librarian of the Lost. A grotesque figure slithered out from between the shelves. It was taller than anything human, its limbs too long, its fingers nothing more than ink-stained claws. The thing's face was hidden beneath a tattered hood, but Sarah could see its mouth, a grotesque grin of jagged teeth stretching far too wide. The shadows bowed before it. It was the Librarian. Sarah stumbled back, clutching the book to her chest. The creature took a step forward, its heavy footfall shaking the floor beneath her. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper. You turn the page. Sarah's fingers clenched tighter around the book. I didn't mean to, she whispered. The librarian chuckled, a sound that sent ice through her veins. It doesn't matter. You belong here now. The bookshelves groaned as they shifted, closing in around her. The figures of lost souls faded into the shadows, leaving her alone with it. Sarah's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Then she remembered the girl's warning. You must write your ending before it writes itself. Her eyes snapped back to the book. The pages were turning on their own, the ink shifting and bleeding, rewriting her fate. And then she saw it. A final sentence forming on the blank page. She screamed as the librarian reached for her, dragging her into the abyss, her story unfinished forever. The final chapter. No. Sarah refused to let the story end this way. She gritted her teeth, forcing every ounce of willpower into her fingers. With a trembling hand, she grabbed a nearby quill. The librarian snarled, lunging forward. Sarah slammed the quill onto the page. And she wrote. But before the librarian could take her, she seized the book and she didn't even finish the sentence. A shockwave exploded through the library. The walls shattered, the bookshelves collapsed, and the librarian screamed, a sound so shrill and unnatural it felt like her skull was splitting. The shadows dispersed into nothingness. Sarah felt herself being ripped away, as though something was yanking her from the pages themselves. And then she woke up. The library of reality. Sarah's eyes snapped open. She was back in the real library. The shelves stood still, the wooden floors solid beneath her. No whispering voices. No shadowed figures. Just silence. The book in her hands was gone. Her breath was ragged, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she just sat there, trying to convince herself that it was over. Then, she heard something. A soft rustling. Slowly, she turned her head. On the librarian's desk, an old book lay open. The pages flipped on their own. And at the bottom of the page, written in dark, ink-stained letters. The girl thought she had escaped, but the story was not over yet. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The pages turned again. A new sentence appeared. She turned around, and saw someone standing behind her. Sarah's body stiffened. A cold breath whispered against her neck. She wasn't alone. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She could feel it. A presence right behind her. A cold, steady breath ghosted over her shoulder, sending ice through her veins. She wanted to turn around, wanted to scream, run, fight, but she was frozen. The book in front of her remained open, its pages flipping on their own, ink bleeding into the paper as new words formed before her eyes. She turned around, and saw someone standing behind her. Sarah couldn't move. The words shifted again. She tried to scream, but a cold hand covered her mouth. And before she could react, a hand clamped over her lips. The keeper of the stories. Sarah's body jerked violently as she struggled against the iron grip. A low whisper slithered into her ear. Shish. It's not your turn to read anymore. The hand yanked her backward into the darkness. She thrashed, kicking, clawing, but it was pointless. It was like being dragged into a pit of ink and shadows. Then, the world changed. The library vanished. Sarah stumbled forward, her feet hitting solid ground. She gasped, spinning around, only to see nothing but an endless void behind her. The thing that had grabbed her was gone. But she wasn't alone. Rows of figures stood in the distance, their faces blank, hollow, waiting. She turned to face the only thing in front of her. A massive wooden desk. And behind it, sitting in a massive high-backed chair, was him. The keeper of the stories. Unlike the librarian, this figure was elegant, timeless, his skin pale like old parchment, his long fingers intertwined on the desk. His eyes were bottomless black voids, reflecting nothing but Sarah herself. The keeper smiled. Welcome, Sarah. She swallowed. Where am I? His voice was silken, slow. You are in the space between pages. The world where unfinished stories live. Where characters wait for their endings. Sarah's stomach twisted. I don't belong here. The keeper chuckled. Oh, but you do. He gestured toward an open book on the desk. Her book. Its pages flipped wildly, words rearranging themselves, rewriting reality. Your story isn't finished yet. Sarah's breathing turned shallow. She had to end it. She had to take control. She reached forward, gripping the edges of the book, but the moment she touched it, pain exploded through her skull. A flood of voices and memories crashed into her mind. The stories that never ended. Sarah saw *** flashes of people, *** their lives, their unfinished fates. A woman who had wandered into a cursed forest and never found her way out. A child who played with shadows and became one himself. A man who read the wrong name in an ancient book and lost his soul to the ink. They were all here. Trapped. Because their stories never ended. And now, she was one of them. Sarah snapped back to reality, her pulse hammering. The keeper was watching her with amusement. "You see now, don't you?" he murmured. "You were never the reader, Sarah." He leaned forward, his black eyes boring into her. "You were always the story." A cold realization settled over her. She wasn't just stuck in a book. She was the book. Her story was writing itself. And if she didn't take control, it would never end. Rewriting the ending. Sarah clenched her fists. No. She wouldn't let this happen. With a deep breath, she lunged forward, grabbing the quill off the desk. The keeper's eyes narrowed. Clever girl. Sarah ignored him. She had seconds before the story swallowed her whole. She dipped the quill into the ink and wrote. Sarah refused to be trapped. She took the book and the world rippled. The shadows screamed. The keeper stood up, his towering form looming over her. "You think it's that easy?" he growled. The pages fought against her, trying to shift, trying to overwrite her words. Sarah gritted her teeth and kept writing. And she tore the last page apart. The book shuddered violently. The entire world cracked, like glass fracturing. The keeper let out an inhuman roar. Sarah didn't stop. She tore the story apart. And with it, the ink bled from the pages, unraveling reality itself. The shelves collapsed. The voices faded. And then, the real world. Sarah gasped as she woke up. She was back in the real library. The book was gone. The room was silent, the air still. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. Had it been real? Had she imagined all of it? Then she noticed. On the librarian's desk, a single page remained. Burnt at the edges. Stained with ink. The last page of the book. Her story's ending. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. The final word stared back at her. And so, she escaped the story. But the library was always watching. Waiting. For the next reader to turn the page. Sarah swallowed hard. And slowly, she backed away. She left the library, stepping into the cold night air. She would never come back. But as the door swung shut behind her, a single page fluttered to the ground. A new story was beginning. Waiting for its next reader. Waiting for you. The end? Or is it just the beginning? Eyes open book,